Good morning! Today we are going to try our hand at realism while we paint a red cardinal, which happens to be the state bird of North Carolina. First, we're going to take a look at the picture closely. This is a photograph, and if I look at it, I can kind of see how the bird makes the bottom part of a circle. Since this is just a photograph that I photocopied, then I can actually draw on top of it. And this is really going to help me keep my proportions perfect. I'm drawing a circle that matches the belly of the cardinal. And then I'm breaking that circle into 4 equal quadrants. Now that I have my plan laid out, I'm going to start my sketch. First, we want to pull out a piece of our mixed media paper. And we want to make sure that it is in landscape because that is the orientation of our reference image. And we want both our paper to match our reference image so that our sketch matches more closely. I'm going to use the large circle template and place it on my white mixed media paper in the position that looks pretty close to what will allow me to show the entire bird. I can start by giving myself nice, light guidelines in the shape of a cross, and then position my circle template so that it is just to the right or just to the left of the center of the page. In this case, I want to position my bird so that it is just to the right of center. And slowly trace my circle template erase the guidelines that gave me the center of the paper, and then give myself matching guidelines on my drawn circle that coordinate with the guidelines that I drew on top of my cardinal. I can use these guidelines to help me measure how the parts of the cardinal relate to the circle and try to make my image compare as closely as possible. Sometimes you can even break up a circle in the same way that you would break up a clock, with 12 being at the top and 3 being over to the right hand side, 6 down at the bottom, and 9 over to the left hand side. That can help you figure out exactly where certain angles of the bird or certain parts of the bird are as it relates to a clock or a circle. So in this case, the crest of the bird is somewhere around 11 o'clock. So I can kind of give myself very lightly those little guidelines that help me know where 11 o'clock would be, and that will help me know where the crest is. The beak is just above 9 o'clock. So I can draw my beak in the correct place just above 9 o'clock, which is also just above the horizontal line breaking through my circle. By laying down my pencil along the edge of where the beak intersects the dark part of the face of the bird, then I can try to get a matching angle on my drawing as well. Now as I move on to the crest, it kind of follows the circle, but it's a little bit inside of the circle. His back comes down at a slope, and I can use my pencil angling it on top of the on top of the photograph first, and then just sliding it over to my drawing so that I can try to match it as carefully as possible. I can draw his wing, and it's just below the horizontal dividing mark of the circle. Drawing realistically means doing a lot of measuring and trying to get the proportions as close as possible to the original or to the reference image in this case. Every part of the bird is measured and compared to another part. So where the eye is, it's important to determine the location of the eye based off of the location of the beak, the location of the head, and that little dark area that kind of comes down like a little beard is important too. Gus is always trying to help. The belly of the bird is pretty close along the bottom of the circle. And the bottom of the bird is hidden by this little bit of a twig that's sticking up from the main branch. I may or may not include that twig in my painting. I get to choose as the artist if it makes sense to keep it or not. If I don't keep it, then I want to make sure that the bottom of the bird is shown accurately, so I can use my measuring angles technique to try to get the whole bird in place. Because the bird is bigger than my paper, his tail is actually going to go off of the paper, and that's just fine. Looking at it, I feel like I made the beak a little bit too big, and so I'm going to come back in and try to make that a little bit smaller. Now's the best time to make adjustments to proportions or shapes before I start to add any ink to it. When you feel pretty good about the proportions of the bird, you can erase the original guidelines and the original circle. So now we're going to work on the feet. And it's really important to have the position of the legs coming off of the body as close as we can get it to the photocopy. Otherwise, he might look like he's falling over. His right leg is to the left of our original guideline that divided the circle from top to bottom. And I can lay down my pencil and then move it over in order to try to get the angle of the little foot, of this little leg, off of the cardinal as accurate as possible. And then it's all about those tiny little claws and the little bird fingers. I'm just looking really carefully, making adjustments and erasing as I go to try to get as close to the picture as I can. These little details go a long way in making a realistic picture. His left leg is coming off at a different angle, and I can lay my pencil down and move it across so that I can see what angle that is. Again, those little feet, those little toes, those little claws. As careful as I can be to see that each of those little toes is going in the direction that my drawing has it, then I'm going to get closer to a realistic image. I'm using my pencil again to help me figure out the angle that the branch is laying at, and then moving my pencil over, trying not to adjust that angle so that it is the same on my paper. If necessary, you can use a second pencil or anything that's straight so that you can kind of figure out that angle as closely as possible. And I'm drawing the branch so that it appears to be underneath the feet, just like in my picture. The picture has this really cool part of the branch where it's kind of a stubby part that sticks up, almost like it was a branch off of it that maybe died or fell off. So I'm going to draw that in too. It's not quite as important that I'm 100% accurate on the branch, but I still like to try to look at the reference image as much as possible, just so that my drawing looks more realistic. I'm going to use the same technique, laying down a pencil so that it is at the same angle as the bottom of the branch, so that I can make sure that my drawing is as close as possible. I've decided to leave off the little bit of branch that's sticking up and hiding part of my bird. And I'm coming back in to try to adjust the eye a little bit, which looks a little bit too big. Now is a great time to start adding some details. Where the shadows are on the back of the cardinal, little indications of feathers just under his neckline, adding more detail on the wings. And since there's snow on the branch, I think that looks really neat. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of a guideline so that when I start watercoloring, then I can leave certain areas the white of the paper. And that's going to really make it look kind of like snow. And then I'll paint the areas of the branch, and that's going to make it look more like wood. This particular tree looks like it might be an aspen tree, which is a really cool tree, and it has this white papery bark. But the only trouble that I see is that the snow on top looks like snow, but the white papery bark on the bottom of the tree, well, it just kind of blends into the background. So this is where I can use artistic license, and I can decide if I'm going to include that white papery bark on the bottom or not. I don't think I am, but we'll see how it goes. So now we're going to get out our small sharpie and start adding some details with the pen. I'm making my eye. And then I'm giving the outline of the little mask that the cardinal has. I'm trying to look as carefully as possible so that my shape matches the original bird as much as I can make it. Cartoons are all about simplifying shapes, but realism is all about looking really carefully and trying to match every little shift and every little adjustment of line or shape. Every 2 or 3 seconds, I look back at the reference image to try to make sure that I'm getting as close as possible. I love being able to use the ink pen to give a nice profile edge. And wherever the feathers are long and smooth, my lines are long and smooth. Where the feathers seem ruffled, I'm trying to make my lines seem ruffled. Now, between you and me, as I'm looking at this, I feel like his beak is still a little bit too big, and maybe his shape of his chest and belly are a little bit too rounded. But those are things that you kind of see later, so just do the best that you can and know that it's good enough. Now we can add the shape of the wing. And the wing is broken into a couple of parts. It has these really long feathers that extend to the tips of the wings. And I'm going to be using lines to develop those long feathers. The short, fluffy feathers that are kind of up around the shoulder have a different texture. The thickness of my pen is consistent, but when I look really closely at his wing, it looks to me like there's a little bit of, I don't know, like shadow between those long, slick feathers and the short, fluffy ones that are closer to his shoulder. So I'm going back over these lines and developing them a little bit. As an artist, you have to remember that you're not a slave to the thickness of the pen that you're using, you can develop your line so that it's more interesting and more artistic and has more character. And in this case, make it match the reference image a little bit more carefully, a little bit more closely than just a single line from the ink pen. You can drop in some shading underneath that wing, and it helps to separate the wing from the body. I'm just using cross hatches, squiggles, little texture lines. It doesn't really have to be a lot, just enough to visually separate the body and the wing. I can see just below his neck, there's these darker areas. So wherever I see those darker areas, I'm going to let my pen kind of help me out, creating a little bit of shading and a little bit of shape. I just love the shape of the feet. I think they're so cool. And I'm going over my pencil lines, trying to, again, double check every couple seconds against my reference image to make sure that the details and the shapes, the angles, and the texture are as close as I can get it to the original. He's looking pretty good, not perfect. I still feel like the chest is a little bit poofy, and I still feel like his beak is a little bit oversized, but that's okay. I'm adding a little bit more texture and a little bit more feathery pen strokes on his wing. And now I can kind of turn to the branch that he's standing on. By giving this snow a nice profile that's not smooth, it's kind of rough, because when snow gathers onto branches, it's a little bit porous, it's a little bit rough, it can be a little bit icy. And so the profile line is really helpful to describe the subject or the object, and in this case it's snow on top of a branch. So I'm going to make sure that the line that I create emulates that snow. Now we can add the bottom of the branch. And then this really cool little like stubby section of the branch. I just love that. This is where I'm going to take a little bit of artistic license. I'm not going to draw the white part of the aspen tree. I'm going to act like this tree has more elongated texture and that it's darker on the bottom where it wouldn't receive as much sunlight. And I'm just making these long, irregular pen strokes that are just trying to create some general tree-like visual texture. Since I'm the artist, I can decide, and I'm not going to add in the white aspen part of the tree. I'm going to continue this texture over against my little stumpy part. And by making my lines a little closer together on the bottom of the stump and then also on the bottom of the tree, it helps it look like it's rounded, gives it more 3 dimensions. I'm also going to add some squiggles, some defined edge just along the bottom of the snow, as if it's casting a shadow. This helps my snow look like it has a little bit of thickness. It also visually helps to separate my snow from the texture on the tree. I'm adding a few more lines, really darkening up the bottom of the tree. And maybe even adding a few more vertical texture as well. I see that I forgot his tail. So I'm adding that in with some delineation of the tail feathers, trying to keep it separate from the wing so that it doesn't look like the wing just becomes part of the tail. I think he needs a little stronger profile, so I'm coming back and adding in just another layer of detail, particularly around the edges and the profile. We're going to add a little bit more shadow just above the left leg where it meets the body, just because I see it in the reference image. And now's a really good time to take a look at the reference image and to take a look at your sketch and to see if there's anything that you can add to make your painting closer to the original reference. The background is this beautiful grayish colored snowy background, and we're going to do something special with that. We're going to be using grays and browns and blues for the background to give us that snowy quality. Kind of like a stormy day. We're going to be using our largest brush, which is our number 10. You can spray your watercolors so that they're ready to go. Before we start with any paint though, we do want to erase all of our pencil lines. If we don't erase the pencil lines now, once we add watercolors, the pencil lines will kind of stick to the paper. We won't be able to erase them later. So make sure that you erase all of those practice lines, all of the stray lines, anything that's pencil, we want to clean it off of our page. To work on the background, we're actually going to turn our paper upside down. That's going to help us get into the small places using the tip of our brush and working away from our bird. It's just going to make everything a lot easier. Make sure that the watercolors have been sprayed so that it's nice and watery. We want the background to be very light. Very light in watercolor means that we want it to be very watery. And then you can pick up some grays. Very watery gray, very light, very kind of stormy, misty. And then make sure that you angle the brush so that you can control where your watercolor and paint is. We can add in some brown. Oopsie, I put in a lot of pigment. So I want to come back and add in more water. Again, I'm making this stormy sky really nice and light. I go super slow up against my bird. You can see that there's so much water, it's almost like a puddle of water. Adding in some blue just makes it kind of more interesting. Blues, browns, and grays really blend beautifully and give that kind of snowy look. As long as the area is still wet, I can keep working on it. But once an area dries, it becomes much harder to work on without leaving streaks or edges. So you get to decide what your sky looks like. You can drop in more color. You can drop in more water. Just keep in mind that you want this to be very wet and very light. If there's so much water on your paper that it kind of needs to be soaked up, you can use a paper towel, dry your paintbrush, and then just gently kind of touch the area that's super wet. You can even tip the paper and move that watercolor around, which is a nice way to help color blend into color. There's a few little pieces of pigment that were left behind on my paper, and I'm just drying off my brush and then just picking those up. If I left them, then it would probably be fine too. Now you can do this really cool technique where you take your brush, dip it in clean water, and then you tap it. By tapping clean water into an area that has watercolored colors in it, then it just makes this really interesting kind of mottled look to it which to me looks very snowy, very winter sky. Just hold your brush at the end and tap on the gold ferrule. And then you can just use your brush or a paper towel to gently blot the little bit of clear water that fell onto the bird, or you can just leave it there too. It's okay, fine. We're going to want to let this dry long enough for our big puddles not to drip. And when we turn it right side up, you can see that there are a couple of spots that we will still see sky, and we want to paint those areas too. So in the bottom right hand corner there's a triangle. We're going to use the same technique, using our grays, maybe some browns, maybe some blues, and really light watery watercolor. We can use the wet into wet technique, which lets us cover an area with water or watercolor and then dabbing in a little bit more color until you get it where you like it. Just again, remember, we're doing a light stormy sky. Similar to what we did up above, we can tap in some clear water and get that really beautiful mottled look. There's one more little area between the body of the bird and the snow-covered branch. So I'm going to use a smaller brush, in this case maybe a 2 or a 4, and the smaller brush will give me more control because I'm painting a much smaller area. And I'm just going to add in the gray, maybe a little bit of blue. And I see that there's one more spot next to his leg and the snow-covered branch. So any area that I would see sky in, I want to add this gray, brown, blue, and maybe a little bit of the clear tapping to make it mottled. Great job, guys. I'm so proud of you.